Hello and welcome to this video, and on this video I want to do something different. It's something I'm hoping to do a lot more in the future, which is take an artist and just focus on one album, the album that I really like by that artist, often when it's not the album that's usually associated with that artist as being the greatest artist. The artist I would really like to discuss is George Duke, right? Who is one of the really great important keyboardists in the 70s jazz fusion scene, along with perhaps Herbie Hancock, Joe Zawinul and Jan Hammer, maybe Keith Jarrett, but much more acoustic, and Chick Corea. And those are the ones you'd mention. Sometimes George Duke doesn't get mentioned quite in the same bracket, but he should be, because he was an absolutely incredible musician. Right? The album that I want to put forth as my favourite George Duke album, the one I'm saying you should check out, is this one. I've got it in a funny version. This is a later Polydor release, where the cover's slightly different. So the original album cover looks more like that. It was just that photograph. And this one, they've added that horrible trumpet that says the Jazz Edition. It's a reissue. But it's basically called I Love the Blues She Heard My Cry. Right? This, for me, is one of the great jazz fusion albums. Now, let's have a little background to George Duke, shall we? George Duke, born in 1946. He's a pianist and trombone player. In the early days, he's playing trombone a lot more than he does later on. And he studied trombone at music college. He emerges in 1966 and makes his first album, which is a straight jazz album in the sort of style and school of the sort of Don Ellis type of jazz that was happening into the 60s. There's a whole bunch of artists around that time. I've got an album that I absolutely love that I will be talking about at some point, called by Roger Kellaway, and it's a sort of it's that type of jazz. It's not so much post Coltrane jazz. It's a sort of quite orchestrated straight jazz. It's swinging, there's quite a lot of brass and on there as well, because obviously got that brass thing. It's not representative of what George Duke does later on. He then makes an album with John Ponte, which is a little bit further out. Great album. And then he starts to release quite a few solo albums. Off the top of my head, I couldn't even tell you some of the albums that come in after that. But they're not the George Duke sound. There's a little bit of fusion and funk comes in there, but it's not the George Duke sound. Around this time, maybe through the Jean-Luc Ponty connection, I'm not too sure, he gets the gig with Frank Zappa, and he joins the Frank Zappa band on trombone originally. And if you watch 200 Motels, you'll see him playing trombone in that band. I think he played a little bit of keyboards, but he was mainly a trombone player. He then leaves the Zappa band and he joins the Cannonball Adderley band, and then he rejoins the Frank Zappa band, and he's in the classic Roxy and Elsewhere band, which everybody loves, right? Now, I think he got two things from those two artists. From Frank Zappa, and there's an interview with George Duke where he said when he joined Zappa band, he was really into Coltrane and jazz, and he thought that was the heaviest way of playing. And Frank sort of sat him down and said, yeah, that is really heavy. Coltrane is heavy. But this thing I'm doing is a different way of being heavy, which I agree with. Zappa had a different way of being heavy. All the comedy and the fun and also the sort of classical orchestration and all that was his version of heaviness, right? And I think from Cannonball Adderley was an incredible post-Charlie Parker styled, post-bebop saxophone player. But the thing that's remarkable about his band, especially the one he had with his brother, was the soul influence. I'm not about funk or R&B, soul, right? It was in quite a lot of hard bop jazz. There's a lot of soul there. It's rooted in soul, gospel, type of music. And I think Cannonball Adderley was brilliant. He's probably the greatest jazz musician. Chico Hamilton did it as well. And so I think that idea of soul and then the idea of Zappa's Mad Universe creeps back into George Duke's work. He signs to what's the label? Is it? He signs to I feel like saying MCP, but MPS. My brain getting old. MPS. He signs to a label called MPS. Now, MPS was a German label that signed a lot of really fantastic, European fusion. I've got a compilation of MPS artists, and it's pretty wild. And George Duke doesn't quite fit in the MPs. He was probably their biggest seller. But they recorded their stuff really well, really great label, and he starts to release albums with MPS. And you slowly start to hear him forging his style, and his style is really based around sort of multi-layered keyboard. He starts playing a lot of bass on Moog bass, so he's got this sort of sound, and he starts to slowly bring in these highly orchestrated sort of arrangements with sort of almost orchestral keyboards overlaid, which I think he got from Zappa. He starts singing, he starts bringing the vocals, which I think had come from Zappa, and then a very strong soul influence. And he does a number of albums. I don't feel he hits his stride until he makes the album Feel. And Feel is the first jazz fusion masterpiece, and it's sort of an essential album in George Duke's catalogue. He follows that up with an album called The Aura Will Prevail, which for many people is the seminal George Duke album, and I wouldn't disagree. Very Zappa influence. I think Zappa's on Feel, and I think a lot of the Zappa musicians are on The Aura Will Prevail. There's actually 2 tunes by Zappa on there. So you really hear the Zappa influence on those albums. If you're a Zappa fan, you must check Aura Will Prevail and Feel, and this one, and the one that came after, because they're really strong Zappa influence there. But Aura Will Prevail is an absolute masterpiece. Absolute masterpiece, and it's the one most people go for. But he followed it up with this album, right? This is my favourite album, and I'm just going to go through it. And if you haven't heard it, you must check it out. It's got George Duke, obviously, in keyboards, vocals. It's got Ndugu, right? Ndugu played in Weather Report, and he eventually played with Michael Jackson. He's one of the great fusion drummers, and in the end, one of the great pop drummers. But he is on many of the George Duke albums, and he really gets to do his thing. And Ndugu was a very influential drummer on me, really incredible drummer. He's got Tom Fowler on bass, which was the bass player from the Zappa band at that time. He's got Lee Ritner on guitar, and also Daryl Stumer, I think, crops up on guitar at one point, who has played with the live version of Genesis. He's got the great Emil Richards on percussion. And a lot of guests. He's got Johnny Guitar Watson on one track and John Wittenberg on violin. George Johnson crops up on guitar, who'd also played as Icarus Johnson. We've discussed him before with Stanley Clarke. There he is. That's why we didn't know who he was, because he's here as George Johnson. So I love this album because what you get with George Duke is he forges this fusion sound, which you have on All Will Prevail. But the vocals start to take over. And after this album, he makes Liberated Fantasies. This is all off the top of my head. Liberated Fantasies, which is even more vocal, but very fusiony. But the vocal stuff starts to creep over, and he eventually starts having some hits. And in some of those albums, I think he makes an album like that, goes to the charts, and eventually he ends up making Brazilian Love Affair, which is a fantastic album of Latin music, and it's like almost like a disco album, and it's brilliant. And he moves through that. So you have this trajectory of him developing this fusion sound, and then taking that fusion sound through to a point where he's got this sort of really quite commercial sound, and then he ends up playing with Michael Jackson, and that's what he does, and he brings that sound into the mainstream. Well, this album's right in the middle, and there's a lot of vocal stuff on it here, which should make me dislike it and feel that The Aura Will Prevail, that album, is the better album, but I don't, because this has got such a magic blend of styles going on. It's a collision of so many different styles. It's quite proggy in that way. It starts off with the tune Chariot, which is a vocal tune, right? He made a lot of funky music, but Chariot is not just George Duke's peak of funk. I always felt it was the funkiest tune ever made. You've got to hear this tune. It's driving. Sometimes funk can be quite slow, but this is driving funk. And it's all over the place, absolutely incredible. And then he goes into Look Into Her Eyes, which has got the guest Flora Purim on vocals, and that's sort of a Latin jazz thing, completely different one. It's done absolutely beautiful. And then you get Sister Serene, which is like a straight R&B vocal ballad. Absolutely wonderful, right? Absolutely wonderful. Then you get That's What She Said, which is sort of like almost like a Mahavishnu orchestra track with electric violin, very fusiony, Then you get very Mashavu, which is a percussion sort of ambient sort of percussion piece, very short, it's only 1 minute 48. And then he goes into a very zappery type track called Rock and Roll, which is a sort of poking fun at the music industry and rock music, and it's very entertaining. And it starts off as sort of a Hendrix type taking the mix sound, but it very quickly goes into quite an incredible instrumental section, which is very zappery. Switch it over and you get Prepare Yourself. Again, he hits you with one of the great funk tracks, this time a really slow, dirty funk. Absolutely incredible. Then he hits you with the jazz fusion. Giant Child Within Us, Ego. It's only 6 minutes long, but it's absolutely monumental. One of my favourite fusion tunes. It really ranks with any fusion tunes. There's a lot of these on George Duke albums. If you go to the other albums, there's some incredible fusion. But he delivers the fusion for you on that track. Then he does the tune Someday. Now, Someday is another straight R&B song, right? But it's absolutely incredible. I used to use this when singers would come to college. I would go, right, you want to improve your singing? I'd give them this song to play. I'd have the chart and give it to them to play. Incredible tune to sing with an, real beautiful vocal that is all over the place with lots of jumps. But then when we get to the middle section, there's like this sort of overdubbed choral section, which is absolutely incredible. And I used to try and get my singers to study that and sing that. Absolutely amazing. And then it finishes with another sort of spoofy tune, but this time taking the mickey out of the blues, and it sounds like they're sort of around George Duke's house with Johnny Guitar Watson, and they pull the guitars out and they're having a jam. This album really spans a big, wide amount of styles, of approaches. It's very funny in places, it's very serious in places, it's very funky in places. I really feel that this album, in all the George Duke albums, really goes the furthest out into this mad zapper territory, which I absolutely love. So this is the album I want to put forth for George Duke. If you never heard George Duke before and you want to get into him, go and check out The Aura Will Prevail, especially if you're a fusion fan. Then Feel. Liberated Fantasy is great. There's some great albums after that when he signs to Epic and he becomes more commercial and you start to have hit records. But the one I would go for would be this one. Go and check it out and see what you think. And if there are any fans of this album that love it like I do, please put in the comments, about how much you love this album, because I've gone through life. I'm the only person I know who knows that album and likes it. I've never met anybody else who loves this album, and it's one of my favourite albums. So it'd be lovely to meet a few people who also love this album. And of course, if you like the video, like it. And if you want to subscribe to this channel, subscribe. And I hope to see you soon, and possibly with another one-off of one of my favourite albums. I think this is going to be a new series that I'm doing here. So thank you very much, and I'll see you soon.